I am Linda van Tilburg, and with me today is Werner Horn. He is a Democratic Alliance, that's the official opposition in South Africa, spokesperson, and a returning member of parliament. Werner Horn, thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon. Lovely to be with you.
Well, before we get to the negotiation process, which everybody is incredibly curious about how that is doing, can we ask you about the fact that the MK party did so well in South Africa? What is the risk of that for violence in South Africa? Because Zuma has been very threatening in some of his statements. The social media campaign of people around him are quite vociferous and against the IEC and specifically against some members. So should we worry about a resurgence of the problems we saw in 2021?
Yeah, look, I think it is a risk. Of course, historically, KwaZulu-Natal as a province and a region has always had a slightly higher political temperature than the rest of South Africa. So the big compromise in the run-up to the 1994 election, with IEC officials sitting through the night to put the IFP at the bottom of the ballot in order to get to some sort of a real peace between the then IFP and ANC, is still very much part of the context in which the MK surged forward. And of course, in terms of ethnic, maybe even tribal politics in South Africa, the Zulu nation has always been more, if not prone to it. It has been more part of characteristics of the Zulu people as a voting bloc. And now with no real Zulu person being part of the ANC leadership, I think there was always that vacuum that could have enabled the MK to come forward. But to get to your question, ultimately, some say, I don't think there's any real evidence, that what we've now been seen is that the leadership behind the July 2021 unrest is now formalized into a political party and is in theory going to parliament and to the KZN legislature, and that if they don't get their way, ultimately they will then turn to, again, instability, causing the type of chaos and even violence that earmarked that period in July 2021. We are hoping that of course can be prevented. Ultimately, hopefully the involvement or the taking up seats will happen. I think the threat to not take up seats and in their reading of the Constitution, forcing a rerun of the election, which is not a correct reading of the Constitution. Hopefully the calmness will set in and they will take up their positions and accept the outcome, because ultimately it was, of course, they believed that they would achieve a 2/3 majority, which didn't then materialize. But from where I'm sitting, I'm honestly not in a position to say that specific province will not see its undeserved and fair share of upheaval and even violence in the weeks and months to come, unfortunately, Linda.
Well, what was very obvious last time is that the South African government wasn't ready for it, didn't respond fast enough to it. So do you think if anything happens in KwaZulu-Natal, they would be ready for it this time around?
Yeah. Now, I believe both in terms of crime intelligence and intelligence gathering, the different structures have upped their game. I serve also on the National Liaison Committee, Political Liaison Committee of the IEC for the Democratic Alliance. And we did request a day or two before the election, when we were already convened in Johannesburg, that the NAT joins. So that's basically the security services and all of everyone clustered together, come and give the Political Liaison Committee a briefing. And it was quite clear, even though they kept it fairly broad and overarching, that they at that point knew where the hot spots could be during voting and in the period after voting. So I firmly believe that they will not be caught off guard again. I think part of the problems in 2021 was, of course, that some in command positions, specifically within the police services, were sort of unwilling to deal with the matter, and that the South African National Defence Force, when deployed, went into an extent blind. So hopefully that can all be addressed through the proper gathering of real-time intelligence and true intelligence about what is unfolding in a province like that.
Well, can we turn to the negotiation process? Because the ANC's majority fell below 40%, and it is looking for either coalition partners or a government of unity, as Mr. Ramaphosa, the one Mr. Ramaphosa apparently favors. Can we ask you if you can give us any information on how those talks are going?
Well, just now, before we spoke, the ANC had a media briefing. So there it ultimately announced that its National Working Committee, so that's a very small group of, I think their top 6 with a few other people, ultimately decided that the so-called Government of National Unity is the model they would favor. But I would suggest that is not final in terms of its model, its preferred model, because tomorrow now and the date sort of is a part of the topic of a moving target. But their National Executive Committee is due to meet. It was to meet last Sunday already, then it was to meet on Tuesday, and then we heard that it would only meet on Saturday, and now it's been brought forward tomorrow. And my understanding of ANC internal structures is unless that body signs off on any model, they won't be able to put it on the negotiating table. Our difficulty with a government of national unity, if it is to be the same model than we had post-1994 as part of the interim or transitional period before our final constitution came into being, was that of course was a government brought about by extending an invitation to serve to all parties that gathered more votes than a specific threshold. I believe in that election it was everyone who garnered more than 2% of the vote. And our difficulty is that, of course, we've already decided as a matter of ideological principle that we will not serve with the MK and the EFF and the Patriotic Alliance in the same government. So if that version of a government of national unity, of course, it's not supported by our constitution any longer, so it will have to be established within the parameters of our current constitution. If that version is what the ANC wants, then we will not be part of it in terms of our current decision from our federal executive. So interestingly, also that first government of national unity, of course, there was 2 deputy presidents, one for the second biggest party and one for the third biggest party, which was then the now defunct National Party as well as the IFP. But our current constitution do not allow for more than 1 deputy president. So there will already have to be some sort of let's say, a variance from that old model.
Sure. So it's quite complicated. What are the risks for the DA here? Because we've seen in sort of coalition governments like this in the past. Well, the National Party eventually withdrew from that government of national unity because they said that they felt they had no real say in the levers of government. And if you look at what happened in a place like the United Kingdom, the Liberal Democrats were demolished by the Conservative parties by forming a coalition. So what are the risks for the DA in such a coalition or government of national unity if you do participate?
Yeah, well, the risks for us to go into any form of a co-governance or coalition arrangement with the ANC is exactly that. If you for a moment forget about the best interests of the country and you look at your own medium and long-term prospects and self-preservation, it very rarely turns out well for any junior or minority partner. Exactly as you put it, because ultimately you're the one who makes most concessions about policies and manifesto promises. Even just to our north, in Zimbabwe, which many people in England and Europe will also be well aware of, where the then mass democratic movement grew substantially, and ZANU-PF was brought under 50%, the same type of call for stability and a renewal brought about by a grand coalition was made and was put into effect. And today the MDC no longer exists, and ZANU-PF just on the back of that arrangement strengthened its hold on governmental power. So there are huge risks. I think from our side, we are, however, at the crossroads that I think we need to do whatever we can do to prevent a situation where the ANC, because of our unwillingness, is driven into the arms of the EFF and MK, who, of course, have expropriation of private land without compensation at the forefront of their manifesto pledges, the nationalization of our independent reserve bank, which has done a good job in the past 30 years to assist managing the economy, interest rates, inflation, etc. So all sorts of very damaging policy proposals, which is at the heart of what EFF and MK promised, to the point where our leader John Steenhuisen at some point called that possibility of an ANC-EFF-MK coalition a doomsday coalition. So we're prepared to do whatever is necessary to prevent that. Having said that, of course, the ANC is a deeply divided party, has been for very long. And ultimately, I don't think there's much we can do to determine the war, so to speak, that is apparently unfolding within the ANC around between the constitutionalists who would naturally want to rather work with parties like ourselves to the center and the right of the political spectrum, and the socialists and the tribalists to the left. So it is complex times, and from our side, even though we are well aware of the risks for ourselves, I think if you really put the country first, you must try and find that balance between working with the ANC if they are prepared for the sake of the country, while being not blind, deaf to the risks for yourself.
So if there's certain red lines in the sand that the DA seem to be drawing, do you think that another model might work better, the one that everybody's talking about, is supply and confidence model?
Yeah, look, that obviously could also enable what we call a minority government. Yes, there's certain risks, even for let's say it ultimately we agree with the ANC that we then take the leadership positions in our legislature, the National Assembly, and the Speaker and presiding officers, as well as committee chairpersons, specifically in the oversight committees and accountability committees, is then taken up by us. One of the risks in that is that, of course, whilst oversight and enforcement of accountability has been watered down in a great way in South Africa over the last 30 years, never given proper effect to, because of the hegemony of the ANC over all levers of power, there is also, of course, the other side of that coin is the fact that no bureaucracy, no government technocrat really wants to be accountable and wants to be transparent. I think that's equally true in all other countries. So one must accept that apart from the fact that there's no culture of true accountability and transparency in accounting to a parliamentary committee of oversight, anyway, it's complicated by the fact that in South Africa it's been enabled by that fusion between the executive and the legislature over many years. So even if we go in there with the best will in the world, we will still find out, I believe, it's very difficult to change that culture. It's not impossible, but if you then, once again, if you look towards self-preservation, if you within the next 3-4 years cannot expose malfeasance, maladministration, and even corruption, and through the committee system deal with it more effectively than in the past, then of course voters will also argue, but you were only there for the bigger salaries that comes with those positions. So that's the one problematic aspect. The other problematic aspect is, of course, that part of the supply and confidence model is, of course, the fact that you give an undertaking not to support motions of no confidence in the president and his executive, giving that stability despite the fact that they govern from a minority position. And in some also even argue that it must entail that you would support the annual budget. Now, that can also be slightly problematic. But even if you say, no, you won't necessarily support the budget, it has to be negotiated with you on an annual basis. And then the same with legislative reform or the legislative agenda of the government of the day. In those cases, I mean, you can quickly find yourself in a situation where very necessary legislative amendments can fall and stumble, just simply because nobody holds a majority, and the supply and confidence model is so flimsy in nature that ultimately it renders the legislature as a body to be so more dysfunctional than it's been over the last 20 years.
Sure. So, if you for a message for the international community, how should they view this? Because the investors were hoping for this tie-up between the ANC and the DA because it brings stability to markets and investors.
Well, yes, I agree that, of course, that stability and maybe even dragging the ANC to a pathway in which, let's say, the economy is better managed, policy positions that has been detrimental to job creation and economic stability can be prevented. Of course, that type of coalition would be first choice. However, I want to say, and that's at the risk of downplaying the complexities that is facing us, one must accept that even whilst the ANC over the last 10, maybe since 2009, when the big state capture project unfolded and was not necessarily undetected, but there was really no way in which to stop that train crash that unfolded within our eyes in sort of slow motion. I want to say that if you now have a ANC minority government which governs in that weakened position, it won't necessarily be weaker than a deeply divided government which had a majority of seats still, or a government that is ultimately, occupied by people whose only agenda is to enable those who, through the state capture project, siphon off and steal public money. So at the risk of downplaying our problems and our complexities, the whole MK splitting off from the ANC might also, in theory, be a bit of a purifying exercise for the ANC. I've not had an opportunity to look at who the ANC will ultimately now, because of the decrease in their support, be sending to Parliament, but it might have the fortunate and unintended consequence of ultimately also getting rid of some of the more problematic characters it normally houses on or accommodates on its candidates list. So, I think we must be careful both in the country and abroad to see to just accept a situation that this is a unavoidable catastrophe that is unfolding. South Africans have a resilience that is very much a part of our character, and even if we can't find ourselves through formal arrangements, hopefully this will at least enable all of us to put South Africa in the best interest of our people, our economy, our constitutional order at the forefront when we go and sit on those benches in Parliament.
Sure. So it's going to be an interesting another 10 days. Thank you so much, Werner Horn from the Democratic Alliance, for speaking to us.
Have a good day.